I politely asked my daughter-in-law not to smoke. On Christmas Day, my son slapped me. 15 minutes later, karma arrived. I arrived at Darren and Nicole's house on Christmas evening, with a pie I had baked that morning, and the red wool scarf my husband used to wear when he still believed winter was something you faced together. The house looked perfect from the outside, white lights aligned like they had been measured with a ruler, wreath centered on the door as if symmetry itself could keep trouble out. Inside, everything shined the way homes do when they are prepared for photographs, not for people. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, adjusting my grip on the pie, already feeling like I had brought the wrong thing to the wrong place. Nicole opened the door, looked down at what I was holding, and her smile stopped halfway to her eyes. "Homemade again?" she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "You really don't ever change, do you?" I stepped in, without answering, because answering only ever made things worse, and Darren took the pie from my hands like it was something he needed to put somewhere out of sight. "Just put it on the counter and sit down." "Mom," he said quietly, the way people speak when they are already irritated, "let's not make tonight harder than it needs to be." That sentence told me exactly where I stood. I was not a guest, not family to be welcomed, but an inconvenience to be managed. I did as I was told, set my coat on the chair I was apparently allowed to use, and sat down with my hands folded like a child, waiting to be corrected. The living room smelled like pine and cinnamon candles, strong enough to make my chest tighten just a little, and I felt the familiar ache in my lungs that never quite leaves anymore. I cleared my throat softly, more out of habit than complaint, and Nicole's head snapped toward me with a look that said my body was already doing something wrong. She did not ask if I was okay. She just turned away, as if the sound itself offended her. Darren busied himself adjusting the music, avoiding my eyes, already choosing peace with his wife over peace with his mother, even in these smallest moments. I had rehearsed a simple request in my head during the drive over, something polite, something reasonable, because my doctor had been clear and I had learned the hard way not to ignore him. I planned to say it gently, after dinner perhaps, when everyone was calm, but the words stayed stuck behind my teeth, because the room made it clear that even breathing required permission. Nicole moved around the space like she owned not just the house but the air in it, straightening decorations that were already straight, glancing at me as if checking whether I was still where I belonged. I felt small in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with being tolerated instead of loved. I had raised Darren to say please and thank you, to stand up when someone entered the room, to know that respect was not something you turned on and off depending on who was watching. Sitting there, listening to him laugh at something Nicole whispered, I wondered when exactly that version of him had slipped away. My chest tightened again, and I took a slow breath, reminding myself that this was just a visit, just one night, and that I could endure it the same way I had endured so many other things, by staying quiet. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt that same tightening, that moment where you realize you are present but not wanted, I want you to know that your feelings matter. And if you feel that justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button and let stories like this stay alive, echoing far, far away, because your support helps bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. And it reminds people like me that we are not invisible. Thank you so much for listening, and please keep listening. Nicole reached into her purse and set a pack of cigarettes on the coffee table like a deliberate choice, not an accident, the plastic crinkling loud enough to feel like a challenge. She glanced at me, then away, as if daring me to say something. I felt the weight of my doctor's words pressing against my ribs, the warning about smoke and lungs, and how damage does not need much encouragement to get worse. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because the room had already taught me that speaking came with consequences. Darren noticed the cigarettes and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I watched Nicole tap one out and hold it between her fingers without lighting it yet, waiting, testing how far she could go. My throat burned, and I swallowed, telling myself I could handle a little discomfort for the sake of keeping the peace, because that had been my role for years. Still, something inside me shifted when she placed that pack there so deliberately, not hidden, not apologetic, but bold, as if my comfort and my health were less important than her right to do whatever she pleased. I looked around the room, at the framed photos of holidays past where my face appeared smaller each year, edged closer to the margin, until finally I was barely there at all. The house was warm, the decorations flawless, but the air felt thin. As Nicole's lighter clicked once, not yet igniting, I thought to myself that tonight I was only asking for one thing, one small courtesy, and that the way they responded would tell me everything I needed to know about where I stood in their lives now. I did not become unwelcome overnight. It happened slowly, through a series of moments so small that each one could be explained away, until one day I realized that everything I was had become an embarrassment to them. Darren likes to believe the distance between us started because I am old-fashioned, because I do not understand how things work anymore, as he once said. The truth is simpler and more painful. I refused to help him lie when lying would have made his life easier. When Darren and Nicole were buying the house, Darren brought papers to my kitchen table and spoke too quickly, the way people do when they hope you will not ask questions. He wanted me to co-sign and confirm numbers that were not true, just a few details adjusted so the loan would move faster. I read every line because that is how my husband taught me to live, and I told Darren I would not sign. His face hardened in a way I had never seen before. He said I cared more about paperwork than my own son. Nicole laughed and said I enjoyed playing saint. That was the first time I felt it, the shift where honesty became betrayal in their eyes. It did not end there. A year later, Darren went to a work celebration and drank more than he should have. He called me late, his voice loose, insisting he was fine to drive. I heard the lie in his breathing and called a rideshare to his location. Someone from his office saw the car pull up, and the next week Darren was called in and warned. He came to my house furious, pacing my living room, telling me I had humiliated him. I reminded him that he was alive. He said that was not the point. From that day on, every time something did not go his way, I became the reason. They wanted my protection, but only if it stayed invisible. They wanted saving without truth, help without consequence. Nicole's resentment grew quieter but sharper. She built her life online, photos of church on Christmas morning, captions about gratitude and blessings, the image of a moral family. In reality, she smoked in the house, cursed when she was angry, and treated kindness like a weakness. Once, when I asked gently if she could smoke outside because my lungs were not what they used to be, she stared at me as if I had insulted her mother. Later, I heard her tell Darren that I looked down on her, that I thought I was better than them. All I had done was ask for air. To Nicole, boundaries were attacks, and my calm refusal to argue made her feel powerless. She could not control me, and that frightened her. What they never understood was that my silence was not approval. I did not argue because arguing had never changed them. I did not apologize when I was not wrong, and that made Nicole furious. She wanted tears, begging, proof that she mattered more than my principles. Instead, I gave her steadiness, and she interpreted that as judgment. After my husband died, a lawyer came by to review documents. Nothing dramatic, nothing I announced. Darren noticed and asked what I was hiding. I told him I was not hiding anything, only holding on to what needed to be kept safe. He scoffed and said I was being dramatic again. From then on, there was an edge to every conversation, a sense that I was something to be managed rather than loved. The deepest wound was realizing that my values were the real offense. I believed in truth even when it was inconvenient, in protecting people even when they hated you for it, and in respect that did not depend on performance. Darren and Nicole wanted the appearance of goodness without its cost. Every time I refused to pretend, I reminded them of what they were not living up to. So they shrank me, spoke over me, treated my presence like clutter. By the time that Christmas came, they no longer saw me as Darren's mother or as a woman who had carried a family for decades. I was a liability to their image, a reminder of rules they wanted to forget. And that is why they hated me, not because I was cruel, but because I would not lie for their comfort. Nicole turned the music up just enough to make conversation feel optional. The song was cheerful, all bells and soft voices, the kind meant to suggest warmth without requiring it. She lit a candle and moved it an inch to the left, then another to the right, adjusting the table as if perfection could be arranged by hand. I watched her work, noticing how every movement was deliberate, how she wanted the room to look like something other people would envy. Darren hovered nearby, nodding at her decisions, checking his phone, present in body but absent in responsibility. I sat where I had been placed and reminded myself that I was here because they wanted me to be here, or at least because they wanted something I still represented. The irony was that they needed me more than they admitted, and yet they treated me like a favor they regretted granting. When Nicole handed me a stack of napkins, I folded them the way I always had, careful and neat, the way my mother taught me when hosting meant caring about the people at your table. Nicole watched for a second, then reached over and refolded them, sharper, tighter. "No, not like that," she said, her voice flat. "It makes the table look sloppy." I pulled my hands back, heat rising to my face, and nodded as if I had made some terrible mistake. Darren did not look up. He did not say my name. He did not say, "Thank you." In that moment, I understood that silence had become his shield. As long as he did not speak, he did not have to choose. And yet, he had already chosen. I tried to contribute something light, something safe, and mentioned a Christmas when Darren was little, when he insisted on sleeping under the tree because he believed Santa might come early. I smiled at the memory before I finished the sentence. Darren cut in quickly, his tone sharp enough to stop me cold. "Mom, don't," he said. "Nobody wants to hear old stories right now." The word old landed harder than the rest. Nicole smiled without looking at me, pleased that he had done the work for her. I swallowed and nodded again, the habit of compliance so ingrained it came without thought. Nicole poured drinks and began talking about her mother, how she handled everything herself, how she never complained, how she just got on with it. She made sure her eyes found mine when she said it. "Some people know how to be strong without asking for attention," she added, her mouth curling slightly. "Not everyone needs to be constantly respected." The room went quiet for a second, the music filling the gap. Darren laughed softly, a sound meant to smooth things over, but it only confirmed what I already knew. He agreed with her, or at least he would not disagree. I reminded myself to breathe slowly. My chest felt tight again, that familiar pressure that comes when air feels just a little harder to find. I did not ask for sympathy. I did not raise my voice. I simply said, carefully, that the smoke bothered my lungs and that I would appreciate it if smoking could stay outside. I made sure my tone was calm, almost apologetic, as if my health were an inconvenience I needed to justify. Nicole's eyes narrowed. She did not answer right away. She looked at Darren instead, waiting to see whose side he would take. Darren shrugged. "It's Christmas," he said. "Can we not do this tonight?" That was all he offered me. No defense, no compromise, just a request that I disappear into myself a little more. The second hand moved steadily, marking time I could not get back. I had spent years watching clocks like that, waiting for moments to pass, believing patience was a virtue that would eventually be rewarded. The truth was that patience had only taught them that I would endure anything. Nicole reached into her purse and placed her cigarettes on the coffee table. Not hidden, not subtle. It was a statement. She tapped one free and held it between her fingers, her eyes on me, daring me to repeat myself. Darren said nothing. He stood close enough to her to make it clear where he belonged. In that moment, I understood my place in their home. I was not a guest to be honored or a mother to be protected. I was a background presence, useful when convenient, ignorable when not. They needed my silence, my compliance, my ability to absorb discomfort without complaint. They needed the version of me that stayed small. As Nicole raised the lighter, I felt something settle inside me. A quiet certainty. I had been asking for respect for too long, believing it would be granted if I proved myself worthy. Watching Darren turn away and Nicole prepare to light that cigarette, I realized they had already decided who I was allowed to be. And for the first time that night, I stopped trying to change their minds and began to accept that whatever came next would reveal the truth they had been hiding from themselves. By the time the guests drifted toward the backyard to look at the lights and someone mentioned checking something in the garage, the house finally went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. The music kept playing, cheerful and oblivious, but the room emptied until it was only the three of us, standing in the same space with no one left to witness what had been building all evening. Nicole moved toward the window and cracked it open just enough to claim she was being considerate. She lit the cigarette anyway, holding it close to the opening, as if that small gesture erased the smoke curling back into the room. The smell hit my chest almost immediately, sharp and familiar, and I felt my breath shorten despite my effort to stay calm. I waited a moment, hoping she would take the hint, hoping Darren would say something on his own. He did not. He stood beside her, arms crossed, watching me like I was the one testing boundaries. I spoke quietly because raising my voice had never helped, and because part of me still believed kindness might reach them if it was gentle enough. I said her name first, the way you do when you are asking for a favor, not making a demand. I asked if she could smoke outside, just on the porch, because my doctor had been clear about my lungs and because I was already struggling to breathe. I made sure my tone was careful, almost apologetic, as if my body were something I needed to excuse. Nicole laughed softly, not loud enough to seem cruel if someone else had been listening, but sharp enough to cut. She told me I was not the center of the world, that everyone else managed just fine, and that I needed to stop acting like everything revolved around my comfort. Her eyes never left mine as she said it. Darren shifted and stepped closer to her, the movement small but unmistakable. He told me she was right and that I always made things uncomfortable, that I had a way of turning every moment into a problem. Hearing my own son say that felt worse than the smoke, worse than the tightness in my chest. It sounded like a verdict he had been rehearsing for years. I felt something break loose inside me then, not anger but clarity. I said his name and asked him, just once, to respect me for the night. I told him I was not asking to be catered to or praised, only treated like a person who mattered. The room went still. Darren's face changed in an instant, the way it does when pride gets cornered. To him, my words were not a request, but an accusation, a suggestion that he had failed. He did not hear a mother asking for dignity. He heard a challenge to his authority, a reminder of obligations he did not want to carry. The next moment came too fast to stop. His hand struck my face with a force that sent a ringing through my head and a taste of metal into my mouth. I stumbled but did not fall. The pain was sharp, but the shock was sharper. Nicole did not move. She watched, expression cool, and said that this was what happened when I insisted on playing the good person, that I always loved pretending to be the victim. I stood there with my ears buzzing, feeling the heat spread across my cheek, and waited for the tears that usually followed moments like that. They did not come. What came instead was a hollow stillness. The hurt was real, but it was not the worst part. The worst part was understanding, finally and completely, that Darren had made his choice long before his hand ever touched my face. He had chosen comfort over conscience, pride over compassion, silence over protection. In that moment, he was no longer my son in the way I had held him all these years. He was someone else entirely, someone willing to hurt me to prove something to himself and to his wife. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the last of my pleading drain away. My voice was steady when I spoke, softer than the music still playing in the background, and I told him that he had made his decision. I did not raise my voice or accuse him. I simply stated the truth as it stood between us. That was when I knew that whatever happened next would not be about asking anymore. It would be about accepting what he had chosen and responding in the only way left to me. I went into the bathroom and closed the door gently behind me, not because I was afraid of them, but because I needed a moment where their voices could not reach me. The mirror caught my face under the harsh light, and I barely recognized the woman looking back. My cheek was already darkening, a clear outline forming where Darren's hand had landed. I ran cold water and pressed a cloth against the skin, not to hide the mark, but to steady myself. My hands were shaking, but my mind was not. Something had shifted, and for the first time in years, I was not trying to fix anything. I was simply acknowledging what had happened. I took a slow breath, the kind my doctor had taught me to take when my lungs tightened, and I listened to my heartbeat until it slowed enough for me to think clearly. I reached into my purse and took out my phone. I did not call the police. I did not want chaos or shouting or explanations that would be twisted against me. I wanted a record, a timestamp, something that could not be argued away later as a misunderstanding or an emotional exaggeration. I scrolled to the number I had not needed to use in years, the after-hours line for the trust administration office that handled my late husband's estate. The voicemail picked up after 2 rings, calm and professional, exactly what I needed. I stated my full name, the address, and the time. I said clearly that I had been physically assaulted in the residence and that I was requesting immediate activation of the protection clause. I did not raise my voice or add emotion. I simply told the truth and ended the call. The confirmation tone felt heavier than any apology I had ever hoped to hear from my son. Next, I opened my camera and took photographs of my face from different angles, making sure the redness and swelling were visible. It felt strange, documenting my own pain like evidence, but I reminded myself that facts mattered more than feelings in moments like this. I placed the phone back in my purse beside the folded medical note my doctor had given me weeks earlier, the one that explained my lung condition and the strict instruction to avoid smoke. I had brought it with me without knowing why, a habit formed from years of being told I was overreacting. Now it sat there quietly, waiting to be seen. When I stepped back into the hallway, Darren and Nicole were still in the living room. Darren would not look at me. Nicole leaned against the counter, cigarette between her fingers, her expression bored, as if this were already behind us. No one spoke. I did not say a word either. I returned to my seat and waited, my purse at my feet, my hands folded again, not in submission this time, but in patience. I checked the clock. The second hand moved steadily, the same way it always had, indifferent to the lives unraveling beneath it. Each tick felt deliberate, as if time itself had finally chosen a side. The doorbell rang 15 minutes later. Darren frowned and stood up abruptly. "Who is that now?" he muttered, irritation laced with uncertainty. Nicole scoffed and followed him to the door, clearly expecting nothing more than a neighbor or an inconvenience she could dismiss. When the door opened, the air in the room changed. 2 people stood on the porch, composed and professional, one holding a leather folder, the other carrying a small case. They introduced themselves calmly, stating their names and their affiliation with the Trust Administration Office. Darren's confusion deepened, his eyes flicking toward me for the first time since the bathroom. Nicole laughed under her breath and said that this was ridiculous, that I had called people to scare them. Her confidence faltered when the woman stepped forward and addressed me directly, using my name with a respect I had not heard in that house all night. She explained that they were there, at my request, that I was listed as the trust protector for the family property, and that they were authorized to deliver documentation and assess the situation. Darren opened his mouth to interrupt, but no sound came out. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger, someone he had underestimated for far too long. I remained seated, my voice steady when I confirmed who I was. I did not explain myself or justify my actions. I simply acknowledged their presence and invited them inside. The folder was opened, papers laid out neatly, and the words that followed were precise and unemotional. They were there because a condition had been breached. They were there because a call had been made and recorded. They were there because what Darren had done was no longer just a family matter. As they spoke, I felt something I had not felt in years settle over me. It was not triumph or relief. It was certainty. For the first time that night, I was not asking for respect. I was standing inside it. They did not raise their voices, and that was what made the room feel smaller. The woman from the Trust Administration Office opened the folder and spoke as if she were explaining something ordinary, the kind of thing she likely explained every day. She said the house was not owned by Darren and Nicole in the way they believed. It was part of a family trust established by my husband years before he died, created to preserve the property and protect the people living in it under specific conditions. Darren stared at her as if she were speaking another language. Nicole folded her arms, her jaw tight, waiting for the part where someone apologized and left. That part did not come. The man beside her explained that Darren and Nicole had been granted conditional residency. They were allowed to live in the home as long as certain standards were met. Standards meant to ensure safety, respect, and lawful behavior. My husband had believed that love did not mean absence of boundaries. He had believed that family should be protected from harm, even harm that came from within. Darren shook his head and interrupted, his voice sharp and defensive, saying that he was the son, that this was his family home, that there had to be some mistake. The administrator did not argue. She simply repeated that legal relationships did not change facts. Being a son did not override the terms of a trust. Nicole laughed again, louder this time, and said they were blowing things out of proportion, that families argued and that no one was hurt. The man looked at her calmly and said that physical assault against a senior resident was considered elder abuse, regardless of intent or explanation. He added that health and safety provisions were not suggestions. The trust included the authority for the trust protector to establish and enforce smoke-free conditions when medical documentation supported the need. I watched Nicole's confidence drain as he spoke. She glanced at Darren, searching for something solid to stand on, and found nothing. Darren's face went pale. He kept saying it could not be true, that he had paid bills, that he had taken care of things. The administrator acknowledged that he had contributed, that he had maintained the home, but she explained that contribution did not equal ownership. The trust had quietly covered insurance, taxes, and long-term maintenance, exactly as my husband intended. Darren looked at me then, truly looked at me, as if a curtain had been pulled back too fast. "You knew," he said, his voice cracking. It was not a question. I did not answer right away because I wanted to choose my words carefully, the way I always had. I told him that I had not hidden anything, that I had simply respected his father's wishes. I had believed Darren would grow into the responsibility that came with generosity. I had believed he would never put me in a position where protection needed to be enforced. The administrator laid out the violations without embellishment. Physical harm had occurred. Medical safety conditions had been ignored. The trust protector, that was me, had the authority to act when those lines were crossed. Darren pressed his hands to his temples, breathing fast, his certainty unraveling. Nicole tried to speak, tried to argue that this was an overreaction, that I was dramatic, that I had always exaggerated. Her words floated in the air and fell to the floor unheard. For the first time since I had walked through that door, no one was listening to her. Darren looked at me again and said my name the way he used to when he was a child, soft and confused. He said I could not do this to him. I stood slowly, my cheek still aching, my lungs still tight, but my spine steady. I told him that I was his mother and that nothing would ever change that. Then I told him the rest, the part that mattered most. I said that being his mother did not mean accepting violence or silence. It did not mean sacrificing my safety so he could feel powerful. I told him that he was my son, but that tonight he had chosen to act like a stranger. The words hung between us, heavy and final. Darren's shoulders sagged as if something essential had slipped out of reach. Nicole said nothing. The administrator gathered the papers neatly and explained the next steps, the timeline, the process, all of it delivered with the same calm professionalism. I listened, nodding when appropriate, not because I was eager for punishment, but because clarity had finally replaced confusion. As they spoke, I felt grief for the boy I had raised and resolve for the woman I had become. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence belonged to me. The administrator slid a document across the table, aligning it carefully, as if precision itself mattered. She explained that Darren and Nicole's right to remain in the house was being temporarily suspended due to a verified breach of the trust's conditions. The words were calm, measured, impossible to argue with. 72 hours were granted for them to vacate while the situation was formally reviewed, with the possibility of permanent removal depending on compliance and further findings. There was also a clause about no contact, activated automatically when physical harm had been documented. Darren stared at the paper as if it were written in disappearing ink. Nicole's mouth opened, then closed, the first sign that her certainty had begun to crack. The man beside the administrator continued, explaining that during the suspension period, all trust-funded expenses related to the property would be paused. Insurance coverage, property tax payments, scheduled maintenance, everything would stop until residency rights were resolved. He said it the way someone reads a weather report, not cruel, just factual. Darren looked up sharply at that. He said he had paid those things, that he had always handled the bills. The administrator nodded again and clarified that while Darren had contributed at times, the trust had covered a significant portion consistently, exactly as outlined in the documents Darren had never bothered to read. The silence that followed felt heavier than the blow I had taken earlier. Darren's face drained of color. He looked at me with something close to fear, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only disbelief. He asked if it had really been me all these years, if I had been paying, if I had been the reason things never collapsed when they should have. I shook my head slowly, not to deny his question but to correct it. I told him it had not been me. It had been his father, who had planned carefully so his son would have help without shame, support without dependency. I told Darren his father had wanted to give him a foundation, not a throne. He had never intended generosity to become a shield for cruelty. Nicole let out a sharp breath and turned on Darren, her voice rising in panic rather than confidence. She said he had told her the house was his, that everything was handled, that there was nothing to worry about. She accused him of lying to her, of putting them in this position. Darren snapped back that she was the one who pushed, the one who never let anything go, the one who insisted on proving dominance over his mother. The words spilled out fast and ugly, years of resentment breaking through the surface. I watched them argue like strangers, the unity they had wielded against me dissolving under pressure. The administrator cleared her throat gently and reminded them that this was not a negotiation. The terms were clear, the violations documented, the timeline set. Darren tried to protest again, saying families fought, saying mistakes happened, saying this should stay inside the home. The administrator replied that violence stopped being private the moment it occurred. Nicole sank into the couch, her bravado gone, staring at the floor as if answers might be written there. Darren stood frozen, the weight of consequences finally settling on his shoulders. I felt no triumph watching them unravel. What I felt was a quiet confirmation that my years of endurance had not been meaningless. The truth had been there all along, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. Darren looked at me and asked what he was supposed to do now, his voice small, almost childlike. I did not tell him. It was not my role anymore. I told him only that I would not be staying in a place where my safety depended on his moods. I told him I loved him, because that was true, but love did not mean protection from consequences. Nicole muttered something under her breath about overreactions and drama, but it carried no weight. The authority in the room had shifted, and she knew it. The administrator handed Darren a copy of the notice and explained the steps clearly one last time. When they finished, they stood and prepared to leave, offering me a respectful nod. I returned it, feeling the steady ground beneath my feet for the first time in a long while. As the door closed behind them, Darren and Nicole stood surrounded by the things they had assumed would always belong to them. The house felt different, not colder, but quieter, as if it had exhaled. Darren said my name again, but this time there was no accusation in it. I picked up my purse, feeling the familiar weight of my phone and papers inside, and realized that the power they had taken for granted was never theirs to begin with. It had always rested in choices, in boundaries, in the courage to stop pretending that endurance was the same thing as love. Darren asked if he could speak to me alone after the administrators left, his voice stripped of the edge it had carried all night. Nicole did not follow us into the hallway. She stayed where she was, staring at the floor, the cigarette forgotten on the table like a habit that had finally lost its power. Darren closed the door behind us and stood there for a moment, rubbing his hands together the way he used to when he was a boy who did not know how to begin an apology. He said my name softly, then said he was sorry and asked me not to do this, not to let everything fall apart. He said he had made a mistake, that he had lost his temper, that things had gotten out of hand. He said family should not be decided by paperwork. I listened without interrupting because I wanted to hear how far he would go without being stopped. When he finished, the silence felt honest for the first time that night. I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since his hand struck my face. I asked whether he was sorry for hitting his mother or sorry because he was afraid of losing the house. The words did not come out sharp. They came out clear. Darren opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked past me, then down at the floor, and finally at his hands. No answer came. Behind us, Nicole did not move. The quiet that followed felt heavier than shouting. It was the kind of quiet that settles when truth has nowhere left to hide. I did not press him. I did not need to. His silence told me everything. I told him that I loved him because that was true, and always would be. But love did not mean I would erase what had happened. I told him I would not live in a place where I could be struck and then expected to pretend it was nothing. I told him I would not fill my lungs with smoke in a house his father had built with care and intention. I said those things once, calmly, because boundaries do not need repetition to be real. Darren nodded without looking up. Nicole remained quiet, her confidence gone, her earlier contempt replaced by a brittle stillness. There was nothing left to argue. That night, I stayed. I stayed not because I needed to prove ownership, but because I needed to end the story where it began, on my terms. Darren and Nicole packed what they needed for the next few days and left without another word. The door closed, and the house settled into a quiet that did not feel empty. It felt earned. I turned off the music, opened a window to let the air clear, and stood in the living room for a long moment, breathing without effort. My cheek still ached, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I went to the kitchen and set the pie on the table. The crust had cracked slightly during the drive, and for once I did not mind the imperfection. I placed the red scarf beside it and looked at the framed photograph of my husband that I had carried with me all evening in my mind. I told him that I had kept my promise, that I had protected the home he loved from becoming a place where respect was optional. I told him that I had finally chosen myself without apology. The words did not feel dramatic. They felt right. Outside, the lights still glowed, and the wreath still hung centered on the door, but the house no longer felt like a display. It felt like a home again. I washed my face, changed into something comfortable, and sat at the table with a small slice of pie, tasting cinnamon and apples and the quiet satisfaction of being able to enjoy something without bracing for insult. I thought about the years I had spent mistaking endurance for virtue, silence for peace. I understood now that patience had its place, but so did limits. I did not feel vengeful. I felt finished. Darren would have to sit with what he had done, and Nicole would have to confront the version of herself she could no longer hide. Their consequences were not mine to manage. My responsibility ended the moment I chose safety and dignity over appeasement. As the night deepened, I turned off the lights one by one and climbed the stairs without hurry. I slept without coughing, without fear, without rehearsing tomorrow's apologies. They had thought I was weak because I stayed quiet for so long. They had mistaken restraint for surrender. The truth was simpler and stronger than that. Silence was never my defeat. It was how I waited for the moment when standing upright would finally matter. Before I close this chapter, I want to say something from the quiet place in my heart where all these memories live. I did not tell this story to punish anyone or to ask for sympathy. I told it because too many people like me are taught to stay silent, to endure, to confuse patience with love and pain with duty. We are told that being old means being invisible, that being kind means accepting whatever is handed to us. That is not wisdom. That is erasure. What I learned is simple, and it took me a lifetime to learn it. Respect is not something you beg for. Safety is not something you negotiate, and love does not require you to disappear. When I finally spoke, I did not raise my voice. I simply stood where I belonged, and that was enough. If this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever been the quiet one at the table, the one expected to absorb the hurt so others could stay comfortable, then know this: you are not weak, you are not wrong, and it is never too late to choose yourself. Silence has power, but so does the moment you decide to stop carrying what was never yours to carry. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, if you believe that truth spoken softly can still change lives, I invite you to subscribe to Grandma True Stories. This channel exists for the voices that were ignored, for the women who were told they were too old to matter, and for anyone who needs a reminder that dignity has no expiration date. Stay with us. Listen, share, and remember this above all else: when a grandma finally speaks, the world should pay attention.